The Stranger's Cold Welcome, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with the arrival of a stranger, a quiet visitor who steps into the village with little explanation and an even quieter smile. In St. Mary Mead, newcomers are usually greeted with curiosity and polite warmth. But this time, something feels different. Whispers follow the stranger through the narrow lanes, and doors seem to close just a little faster than usual. Then, before the village can decide whether to trust or fear their guest, a chilling discovery is made. Miss Marple notices the tension others pretend not to see, the uneasy glances, the hurried conversations, and the simple truth that someone in the village recognized the stranger long before anyone admitted it. Because sometimes, a cold welcome isn't suspicion. It's fear. Before we uncover why the stranger was never meant to return, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Stranger's Cold Welcome. The village of St. Willoughby was the kind of place where time seemed to move slowly and quietly, as though the outside world had forgotten it entirely. The narrow road that passed through the village had looked almost exactly the same for many years. Small stone cottages stood in neat rows, their gardens carefully tended by the same families who had lived there for generations. Each morning the bakery filled the air with the smell of warm bread, the church bell rang at the same hours it always had, and the villagers greeted one another with the same polite smiles that had been exchanged thousands of times before. To an outsider, it appeared peaceful and ordinary. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that even the calmest places could hide the most complicated human feelings. Miss Marple sat comfortably beside the front window of her small cottage on a cold autumn afternoon, her knitting needles moving slowly and carefully through soft wool. The sky outside had grown heavy with grey clouds, and the wind carried a sharp chill through the empty road. Leaves scraped along the stone path as they were pushed by the restless wind, and the branches of the old trees along the lane bent and swayed quietly. Miss Marple's eyes often moved from her knitting to the road outside, because she had always believed that watching people was one of the best ways to understand them. Human nature, she often said, rarely changed, no matter how much people tried to hide it behind polite manners. That afternoon something unusual caught her attention. The village bus had arrived. The bus only stopped in St. Willoughby twice each day, and usually it carried nothing more interesting than letters, small packages, or perhaps a visitor coming to stay with relatives. But this time only one passenger stepped down onto the quiet road. The man stood beside the bus for a moment as it pulled away again, its engine fading slowly into the distance until the village returned to its usual silence. He carried a dark suitcase and wore a long coat that the wind pressed firmly against him. His hat sat low on his head, but even from her window Miss Marple could see the strong outline of his face as he slowly looked around the village. There was something thoughtful about the way he examined his surroundings. Most visitors arrived with a look of confusion, turning their heads from one building to another as they tried to understand where they were. But this man did not appear confused at all. Instead, he studied the village calmly, as though he had expected exactly what he saw. Miss Marple lowered her knitting slightly and continued watching with quiet interest, because strangers were rare in St. Willoughby, and strangers who appeared so certain of themselves were even rarer. Elsewhere in the village, the newcomer had already attracted attention. Curtains shifted gently in nearby windows as curious eyes observed him. Mrs. Dalton, who lived across the road, moved her curtain just enough to see him clearly without being noticed. 2 houses farther down, another curtain moved as well. In small villages, curiosity traveled quickly and silently. Miss Marple knew that before the evening was over, nearly everyone would know about the stranger who had arrived. The man began walking down the main road with calm and steady steps, his suitcase swinging lightly in one hand. He did not hurry, even though the cold wind brushed against his coat and the sky threatened rain. His path eventually brought him to the center of the village, where the only inn stood beside the small grocery shop. The inn was called the Willow Lantern, a modest but welcoming place that had served travelers and villagers alike for many years. Inside the inn, warmth and light filled the main room. A small fire burned steadily in the fireplace, sending gentle heat through the air. Behind the wooden counter stood George Holbrook, the owner of the inn, polishing a drinking glass with slow and careful movements. George had owned the Willow Lantern for nearly 20 years, and during that time he had come to recognize nearly every face that passed through the village. So when the door opened and the stranger stepped inside, George immediately knew that this man was not someone who belonged to St. Willoughby. George placed the glass down and greeted the man politely, because welcoming travelers was part of his daily work. The stranger removed his hat and brushed a few drops of moisture from the brim before speaking. Up close, George could see that the man was perhaps in his early 40s, with sharp features and calm eyes that seemed to observe everything carefully. His expression was serious but not unfriendly. "I would like a room for a few nights," the man said in a quiet, steady voice. George reached for the large guest book that rested on the counter and opened it to the next blank line. Visitors were not very common, but it was always good business when they appeared. He dipped his pen in ink and looked up again. "Of course," George said warmly. "May I have your name, sir?" For a very brief moment, the stranger hesitated. It was only a second, but George noticed it because he had spent many years observing travelers. Then the man answered, "My name is Daniel Hargrove." George wrote the name carefully into the guest book and slid it across the counter so the stranger could sign beneath it. Hargrove's handwriting was neat and precise, each letter written with careful attention. When he finished, George handed him a small brass key. "Room 4, George said. "It's warm and comfortable. Supper will be ready soon if you plan to stay." "Thank you," Hargrove replied calmly. He picked up his suitcase and walked toward the staircase without adding anything further. George watched him climb the stairs until he disappeared from view, and then he slowly returned to polishing the same glass he had been holding earlier. Something about the man made him thoughtful, though he could not clearly explain why. News in St. Willoughby traveled quickly without anyone ever seeming to spread it deliberately. By the time evening approached, several villagers had already heard that a stranger named Daniel Hargrove had taken a room at the Willow Lantern. In the grocery shop, Mrs. Dalton quietly mentioned it while weighing vegetables for a customer. At the bakery, Mr. Wilkes wondered aloud whether the man might be a writer looking for peace and quiet. Others guessed that he might be visiting someone in the village, though no one could think of a family expecting a guest. Miss Marple heard these discussions later that evening when she stopped by the shop for a small bag of tea biscuits. She listened politely while others shared their theories, but she offered very little opinion herself. Instead, she simply smiled and nodded, allowing the conversation to continue around her. As she walked home along the dimly lit road later that night, the wind had grown colder and the clouds had darkened the sky even more. Yet her thoughts remained fixed on the stranger. She remembered the calm way he had studied the village when he first stepped off the bus. It had not been curiosity that she saw in his eyes. It had been something quieter and more determined. Purpose. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that when someone arrived in a quiet place with a clear purpose, it rarely meant something simple. Later that night at the Willow Lantern, Daniel Hargrove sat alone in the dining room finishing a cup of tea after supper. The fire beside him burned softly, and the inn had grown quiet as the last villagers returned home. George Holbrook approached the table with a friendly smile, still curious about his guest. First visit to St. Willoughby? George asked casually. Hargrove looked toward the window where the wind tapped gently against the glass. Yes, he replied. It's a peaceful village, George continued. Nothing much ever happens here. For a moment, the stranger seemed to consider those words carefully. Then he spoke again in the same calm voice. That is exactly why I came. George nodded politely, but the answer left him with a strange feeling he could not explain. Later, upstairs in his room, Daniel Hargrove placed his suitcase on the bed and opened it slowly. Inside was a small envelope. He removed it carefully and pulled out a photograph that had clearly been taken many years earlier. The picture showed a group of villagers standing together outside the church, smiling proudly for the camera. But one face in the photograph had been circled with dark ink. Daniel Hargrove studied that circled face for a long time in the quiet room while the wind continued to whisper against the windows of the sleeping village. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the inn, the peaceful life of St. Willoughby continued exactly as it always had. But very soon, that peace would begin to break. Chapter 2: The Stranger's Cold Truth. Morning settled over St. Willoughby with a pale, quiet light that slowly crept across the stone cottages and narrow lanes. The village looked exactly as it always had. Smoke rose from chimneys, shop doors opened, and neighbors greeted one another with calm familiarity. To anyone passing through, nothing would have seemed unusual. Yet beneath that ordinary morning, a subtle tension had begun to form, though most of the villagers did not yet realize it. Daniel Hargrove walked down the main road with steady steps, his dark coat buttoned tightly against the cold air. His eyes moved carefully from house to house, studying the village with calm attention. The place looked peaceful, but he knew that appearances often hid far more complicated truths. He had not traveled all this distance simply to admire quiet scenery. He had come because of a question that had followed him for many years, a question that had never been properly answered. Miss Marple happened to be walking along the same road when she noticed him again. She greeted him politely, just as she had the day before, but this time she watched him more carefully. There was a seriousness in the man's expression that suggested a heavy purpose. People sometimes carried secrets in their eyes, and Miss Marple had spent a lifetime recognizing the signs. Hargrove returned her greeting and paused for a moment as though deciding whether to continue walking or to speak. Finally he asked a simple question. He wanted to know where he might find the village church and the old parish records. Miss Marple pointed toward the small hill where the stone church stood overlooking the cottages. She also mentioned that the Reverend often kept old records inside the church office. The stranger thanked her politely and continued on his way. Miss Marple watched him disappear down the road, her thoughtful eyes following him until he was out of sight. Something about the man's careful question stirred her curiosity. Villages were full of old stories, and sometimes strangers arrived because they wished to uncover one that had been forgotten. Inside the church, the air felt cool and still. Sunlight slipped through the tall windows, casting long pale shapes across the wooden benches. Daniel Hargrove stepped quietly through the aisle until he reached the small table where several framed photographs rested. One photograph in particular held his attention. It showed a group of villagers gathered outside the church many years earlier. Their smiles suggested pride and happiness. At the center of the photograph stood a tall man with confident posture and friendly eyes. Arthur Bellamy. The same face that had been circled carefully in dark ink on the copy inside Hargrove's suitcase. Hargrove studied the photograph for several long moments before footsteps echoed softly behind him. Reverend Thomas Hale had entered the church and approached with polite curiosity. The two men spoke briefly, and Hargrove eventually asked about Arthur Bellamy. The Reverend explained that Bellamy had once been one of the most respected men in St. Willoughby. He owned farmland and had helped many villagers during difficult years. Nearly 15 years earlier, however, he had died suddenly. The village doctor had declared it a natural illness, and the matter had quietly ended there. Hargrove listened carefully without interrupting. Then he asked a question that made the Reverend hesitate. "Did anyone ever question the doctor's conclusion?" The Reverend shook his head slowly. At the time, there had seemed to be no reason for doubt. Bellamy had complained of weakness during the days before his death. The doctor had examined him and declared that his heart had failed. The answer did not surprise Hargrove. He thanked the Reverend and left the church quietly, though his thoughts were far from calm. The explanation he had heard matched the official record he had already read. Yet the photograph in his pocket had always suggested something else to him. Later that afternoon, Hargrove visited the small cemetery behind the church. A cold wind brushed across the hillside as he walked between the old gravestones. He eventually stopped before a stone bearing the name Arthur Bellamy. The inscription described Bellamy as a beloved member of the community. Hargrove stared at the name for a long time before speaking softly to the empty air. "My father trusted you." The words disappeared into the cold wind. For the truth was simple, though the village had never known it. Daniel Hargrove had not arrived as a curious visitor. He was the son of a man who had once worked for Arthur Bellamy many years ago. His father had been a quiet and loyal man who managed Bellamy's farm accounts. Shortly before Bellamy's sudden death, Hargrove's father had discovered something troubling. Money had been disappearing. Large amounts of it. At first his father had believed the records must contain mistakes. But the more he checked the numbers, the clearer the truth became. Someone had been stealing from Bellamy for years. And when his father confronted the man he suspected, everything had changed. His father had never spoken clearly about that meeting. He had only said that the man had promised to handle the situation quietly. But a few days later Arthur Bellamy had died suddenly, and the matter had never been discussed again. For years Daniel Hargrove had wondered whether his father's suspicions had been correct. Eventually, after his father passed away, he found a small box containing old documents and one photograph of the village gathering outside the church. His father had circled one face in that photograph. The face of Dr. Leonard Crowley. The same village doctor who had declared Arthur Bellamy's death to be natural. Hargrove had spent years searching for answers, and eventually he discovered something important. Shortly after Bellamy's death, Dr. Crowley had sold his home and moved away from the village with surprising wealth. The records suggested that the doctor had lived comfortably ever since. But 2 months earlier, Crowley himself had died in another town. And when Hargrove examined the doctor's estate records, he found proof of hidden bank accounts that could only have been created with stolen money. The truth became clear. Dr. Crowley had been stealing from Arthur Bellamy for years. When Bellamy discovered the theft and confronted him, Crowley poisoned him slowly and then declared the death to be natural illness. As the only doctor in the village, his word had been accepted without question. The perfect crime. Or so Crowley had believed. Standing beside the grave, Daniel Hargrove finally felt the long search come to its quiet end. The man responsible was already dead, and the stolen money had vanished long ago. There would be no dramatic arrest, no public trial. Only the truth. Later that evening Hargrove visited Miss Marple's cottage. Word had reached him that she was a thoughtful observer of village life, and he felt that someone deserved to hear the truth after all these years. Miss Marple listened carefully as he explained everything. She did not interrupt while he spoke, and when he finished she nodded slowly, her expression calm but thoughtful. "It is a sad story," she said gently. "Greed has a way of hiding behind respectability. People trust doctors and community leaders because they want to believe in them. That trust can sometimes be misused." Hargrove agreed quietly. He had not come to the village seeking revenge. He had only wanted to know whether his father's doubts had been justified. Now he knew they had been. The following morning Daniel Hargrove packed his suitcase at the Willow Lantern. George Holbrook watched with mild curiosity as the stranger prepared to leave. "Heading out already?" George asked. "Yes," Hargrove replied calmly. "I found what I came for." George nodded politely, though he did not ask further questions. Travelers often arrived with private reasons, and it was not his habit to pry. The bus arrived at the edge of the village just as the sun began to climb higher into the sky. Hargrove stepped aboard, took one last look at the quiet cottages of St. Willoughby, and then the bus carried him away down the long road. By afternoon the village had returned to its usual calm routine. The stranger had come and gone, leaving little behind except a brief moment of curiosity. But in Miss Marple's mind, the story remained. She sat beside her window later that day, her knitting resting quietly in her hands, and reflected on the strange way the truth sometimes returned after many years. Secrets could remain hidden for a very long time, but human nature had a habit of revealing them eventually. Sometimes it took patience. Sometimes it took a stranger. And sometimes the cold welcome of a quiet village was only the beginning of a story that had waited many years to be told. If you enjoyed this mystery and would like to hear more quiet village secrets uncovered, be sure to follow the channel and join us for the next story, where another calm place may be hiding another truth waiting patiently in the shadows.